So Dr. Hesse, what do you have your PhD in?
Physical chemistry.
Okay.
Now, go figure how that relates to being a deacon, but actually,
Yeah.
we might get into that a little bit.
My
okay?
dad is also a physical chemistry
Really?
PhD.
Really?
And he's a pastor now, so maybe you guys share some.
Well, I was interested in math and science, and that was kind of what led me to that, because it involves both pretty much.
Yeah.
So, at any rate, we'll try to make this short and intimate, and I guess this is the last in the series, right?
Last one, yeah.
Okay, so
This is our final stop.
6 of 6.
either we're the capstone or we're dead. I mean, this is the title was Sacred Sites, and you're probably, you know that we're going to go over to the Cathedral later, but I wanted to kind of be clear what to Catholics sacred sites are. The sacred sites are within each of us. It's not a building. Okay. Now that doesn't mean that's not a sacred site, but the sacred sites are within everyone, because in Catholic belief system, God dwells within everyone, regardless of their faith belief. So a Buddhist may not believe they have God dwelling within them, but we do. And if they don't, that's okay. Just that's what our belief is. Okay. And this affects how we are going to talk about this subject. It'll be it's kind of an outline of what I want to talk about. Give you a little scripture and history, because religions have sacred texts. Some principled bioethics as to how we approach things from an ethical standpoint. Then the important issue of conscience and consciousness, which is very important in the Catholic tradition. And then we're going to go over some scientific studies. Being medical students, I thought you might find that interesting. And then faith and prayer. Okay.
I don't know if I can read that.
And we'll talk about that book a little bit later. Scripture and history. We're just going to hit the highlights, because we're only looking at about 30 minutes, maybe 35. Depends on how long-winded I get. But it may be hard to read this. And is this in focus or not?
You can try moving it back.
If you want to try focusing it, it's kind of delicate. This is the focus
Can we move
here.
it backwards?
Well, I can't, because this cord is not
Oh,
long
that's
enough. Sorry.
Maybe we can just move closer.
Yeah.
I can read it now.
Yeah, bring it close. Okay.
10 visions.
These are just some of the scripture passages in the Catholic tradition, Christian tradition. The first one is the Good Samaritan, and that's a painting by Emmy Moreau in 1880, which I thought was a beautiful painting. He went to him and bound him up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him home to the inn and took care of him. And what's important about this is the Jewish tradition and the Samaritans were separate. So this was a way of Jesus saying everyone is to be healed. Okay. The next, this is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. That's going to be critical in our discussion. That's basically the one commandment Jesus was teaching. Not that he was against the other commandments, but that was the key one. We are strong, we have obligation to heal the feelings of the weak and not to please ourselves. Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. He said to the man who was paralyzed, I say to you, rise, pick up your stretcher and go home. He stood up immediately before them. And then the last one here, all who had people sick with various diseases brought them to him. He laid his hands on each of them and cured them. So in the Catholic tradition, Jesus was introducing healing of body and soul together. It was always kind of tied together. And these are all of the healing miracles in Scripture that relate to specific historic figures. This is not an imagination, it's actually historic figures. And I won't go through all of them, but basically the scripture's replete with these healing moments that Jesus would do. And so to give a little historic background on the Catholic Church's taking this stuff seriously, of course there's Jesus' teaching, which we just went through. Then St. Luke of the four evangelists was a medical doctor. So he set that tone with Jesus. And his Gospels write about this. So he's giving it from the medical doctor's standpoint. But of course, they didn't have the benefit of modern science as we do today. Okay. Then it proved itself out in the helpfulness of the Christian congregations to help get people through the smallpox epidemic of 180. And so that was one of the big issues. Now these are just highlights. I'm telling you, there's a whole slew of things that we could go through. Constantinople built a hospital in Istanbul, back then known as Constantinople. And the first medical school in the 800s was in northern Italy. Then in 1023, the Malta Knights of Hospitaller, they were the first such organization in the world. And I've been to Malta. It's strategically located in the middle of the Mediterranean. And to this day, the Knights of Malta are known for helping people in hospitals and the sick, etc. And then I bring out Blessed Mother Teresa because this is not just historic, it's recent, where people are trying to help the sick, okay, taking them off the streets and helping them. So what is the history of Catholic healthcare, basically? And a lot of people don't realize this, but it's the world's largest non-government provider of healthcare. 26% of the world's healthcare is provided by the Catholic Church. Huge. 18,000 clinics, 16,000 homes for the elderly, 5,500 hospitals. 65% of hospitals in developing countries are Catholic. So this foundation of our faith on Jesus' teaching took on a real meaning. This wasn't just praying, this was active, which is what Jesus was saying when he would heal people. Okay. So this brings us pretty much to the second subject, and that's principled bioethics. And what does that mean?
I have a question, Bob.
Yeah.
Real quick. That massive infrastructure and organization, is that still headed by the Pope?
Yes, but it's through a different organization that's not necessarily tied to a local archdiocese.
Okay.
So the Catholic healthcare system just spent $1 billion buying St. Luke's Hospital, and they're going to spend another $1 billion improving it. $2 billion in that place just alone. They originally the Catholics didn't have a hospital down there because they wanted to build a hospital close to the poor people down here in Houston,
Yes.
which was St.
Joseph.
Yeah. And so that they're starting to realize they got to be in the medical center, so they're buying that. So that's an organization buys it, but it ultimately has reports to the Pope. And the Pope doesn't get involved in this that much, except for principled bioethics and what does it do. And that's the key where there is an influence.
Would you think the purchase of St. Luke's would have been a blip on the Pope's radar? Did he get a briefing about it, you think?
That's a good question. He probably heard about it, but he's so inundated with stuff worldwide.
Yeah,
I don't think he dwelled on it very long.
Yeah, I got you.
But that's it's pretty amazing. I mean, there are deep pockets in the Catholic Church for doing this.
Yeah.
So are these lay people or priests that are?
Excellent question. And by the way, while we're going, if you don't mind having this be recorded, they don't know who you are. I don't want to, whatever. But I think we can talk as we go. More so now. But originally, for all those centuries, it was monks and nuns that were serving, and they were the doctors and the nurses. And about 200 years ago, there was this split away from into more secular approach. And the man that is the editor of that Bible on the subject of medicine and religion, and I think you should all be very much aware of this book if you're not already. He's a Catholic, and Harold Koenig, and he made a statement at the Malta conference that struck me, because he was a keynote speaker when I was in Malta. And he said, the grand experiment of separating religion and medicine 200 years ago has failed. And he's absolutely right. It's failed. And I'll get into why we think that. Okay. But that's a compendium of all the research on, scientific research, on why religion helps healing. And it's meant to be very interfaith. It's not just Catholic. Okay? So principled bioethics is basically the subject I want to cover now. And there are three different ways to make moral judgments. One is subjective. In other words, how do I feel about this? Do I feel like I'm doing something wrong, whatever? The second is legalistic. You'll see this in some traditions where it's absolute literal interpretation of their scripture readings. And the third is principled. Now, all faiths have dabbled in all of these. The Catholic Church is principled approach. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means that in their extreme form, subjective and legalistic lead to the same place, and that is you don't have to love other people. In the subjective, if it's really extreme, it's all about me. In the legalistic, in the extreme, it's all about literal interpretation of sacred texts, and some of these sacred texts are not too kind. Let's face it, okay? No matter what the religion. And so the question has become for Catholics is a principled approach of faith and reason. And in Catholicism, unlike a lot of other Christian religions, faith and reason play a major role, and one cannot contradict the other. Very interesting. And what is the main principle? Well, I already put it up there on one of these other slides, and that is the guiding principle behind Catholic bioethics is this: I give you a new commandment that you love one another just as I have loved you. Okay? Now, you'll notice that this is not the golden rule. The golden rule can be dangerous. It sounds real nice, you know, but if I don't believe in euthanasia, and I've got somebody that is ministering to me and believes in euthanasia, I don't want that person doing to me what they would have someone do to them. So in the golden rule, in a way, is a subjective approach. Now, I'm not saying it's all bad. I mean, it does bring religions together a little bit. But I think we have to be very careful on knowing what the implications are of the golden rule and its application. If you believe that if somebody doesn't convert to your belief system, you can kill them, I don't want that person applying their golden rule to me. Okay. So it can be iffy. Okay. Now, when we're talking about love one another, well, who is one another? Well, in the Catholic belief system, it's human life. It's human beings, starting from actual conception to natural death. Now, this abortion or euthanasia fall into this category of culture of death. And so in the Catholic tradition, we don't believe in that. There are arguments used to say, well, it's not real life except at a certain point, and then that has to be walked back when they realize that the fetus feels pain by that time. So suddenly the date is moving back. The truth is, from a scientific standpoint, we can't say, and I'm speaking from a scientific standpoint, we can't say when life begins, other than conception is a safe bet. It's a safe bet, okay? Now, the heart of this...
I have a quick question about that. So not with the abortion, but the euthanasia concept, where do you draw the line between euthanasia and, like, not giving... So you have a brain dead patient and you withdraw life support, how do you differentiate like something like that where you're withdrawing care, you're not causing them to die, you are...
Wonderful
just-
question. I'm going to get into that.
Okay.
So if you
All
give me
right.
a second,
Absolutely.
it's exactly what we want to get into.
Okay.
So this non-dualism principle is very much of a Christian Catholic principle. And what's interesting about Catholic bioethics is most of the hospitals utilize Catholic bioethics, even non-Catholic hospitals, but quite often don't realize the source. One of the questions I had in this other presentation was, where did this come from? Well, this evolves in Catholic theology. As we become more scientifically knowledgeable, we evolve, but we never contradict our principles. That's the idea of a principle, okay? And so when you're applying this bioethics approach, it started with in the 4th century with Augustine, Aquinas in the 12th century, I think it was 13th. So their writings have continued. So it builds, and that's what I'm going to try to give you today is where it's built to. So this non-dualism principle says that the body and the soul are made for each other. They're interstitial. And that healing of one can affect the healing of the other, which is basically what Jesus was doing in his writings, okay? And so faith and reason coming to the body have to be consistent with our faith and theology. Reason and science have to be consistent with the faith and theology. Who's now a saint, St. Paul, Pope John Paul II said, faith can never conflict with reason. So as a scientist, I can feel real comfortable with this. Because if there's a contradiction, I've got to really start doing some evaluation. Okay. And it's usually a contradiction in my interpretation as opposed to something objective out there. Now, I would say that this non-dualism is not held by other faith beliefs in the world. So in the East, a lot of Eastern faiths will believe in dualism. And it's because they believe in reincarnation, which we don't believe in. Now, I will get into that a little bit later, but I attended a conference, bioethics conference, at a very interfaith organization. And I won't say which Eastern faith it was, but basically what surprised me, and I was learning, was that under certain circumstances, suicide is acceptable because you're killing only that body, you're going to get another one. Now, their definition of suicide may be different. They may say, well, suicide is killing the soul and you can't do that. But your belief systems have serious consequences. And so if that's a concept that people are comfortable with, they have to understand what the consequences are. That's not the case in the Catholic approach. Okay? So throughout the history of Catholic bioethics, there has been a prioritization of principles, if you will. And I want to go through these, which is going to get to answer your question, okay? Each one of these trumps the next one. So I'll give you the most important one, the second, okay? The first is ordinary human dignity. In other words, you can't withhold food, water, shelter, clothing. You've got to give human beings dignity. Very basic dignity, okay? Now, the second is you don't intentionally kill, okay? So, my mother, I'll give you personal examples. My mother was getting up in years, and I knew that one of the things that can happen to an older person is they fall, break a hip. First, she had a stroke, so she was paralyzed on one side, fell, broke a hip, had a catheter, had an infection. And I said, now, if that happens, Mom, she was 89 when she died, do you want us to give you antibiotics? And she said, no. She said no. So, we withheld antibiotics, not because we wanted to kill her, but because we had to honor her wishes. So we were honoring the patient's wishes, and we were not intentionally killing, and we were still giving her human dignity. Antibiotics is in food and water and things like that, okay? So this has a play out in practical terms, okay? So,
I do have a
Yeah.
question on the ordinary human dignity. Would you, beyond food, water, and shelter, would you consider like the person's agency? So in your example, your mother's, like would her judgment to not take antibiotics possibly fall under her dignity, like to maintain her corporal, like to maintain her body in her own way?
Good point. I'll give you an example of an atheist that I ministered to. Okay, it's a strange story, but there was a woman who converted to the Catholic faith. She was young in her faith. She had 2 daughters. Her father was dying of a cancerous brain tumor in the house. She asked me to come over and meet with him. And I said, well, I'd be happy to. She said, but I need to tell you as an atheist. I said, well, I don't want to impose myself on him if he doesn't want me to. And I'll get into this subject a little bit more why, because it's very logical. She said, no, he wants to do this for us. So I went over to meet with him. And I won't go through a lot of the details, but basically, he was starving himself to death because he knew. He was a medical doctor, and he was the top in his field in the world. If I told you what field it was, you'd probably be able to identify who it was. And he was smart. He knew that if he kept eating, this was not going to be a pretty ending, okay? So he was starving himself. He was basically, his own wishes were violating Rule 1. Am I going to judge him? No way. No way. I cannot judge that person. And I will get into why we can't do that judgmental stuff. But for me, I don't know if I would have the courage to play out my belief system, but my belief system would tell me not to do what he did. I don't know if I answered your question. Okay.
May I also ask a question or a
Yeah.
point of clarification? So in case of an abortion, you want to honor the patient's wishes, but your patient in that case isn't only the mother, it's also the baby inside of her. Is that where your case for abortion?
Can you hold that just for a second? Because we're going to get closer, because that's an excellent question. I think that's an excellent question. Yeah, I'll give you a hint, though. What did we say about life? Where
He
is
gets
life
that
begin and end?
conception.
So both lives have value.
Yeah.
And so we can't intentionally kill one to save another. Now, when it comes to applying this in a case study, in an actual case, this is not easy.
Yeah.
And that's what I want to get into, okay? Because it's not easy to apply the principles. Principles are meant to be kept, but applying them is a challenge. Okay, so the fourth one is minimize patient suffering. So my father is dying, and I could tell he's in pain. So I leave the room and I say to the nurse, I think he needs more pain medication. I get home and I got a call from my father. He said, you told them to give me pain medication. I didn't want it. Well, if I knew he didn't want it, I would not have told him that. But the point is that I was applying 4, but I was violating 3. And this is prioritized. So if I had known that, I should have said to the nurse, do whatever he wants. But I saw him suffering. Okay. He said, I want to be there when I make the transition. I want to be conscious of it. So these are little personal stories in how to apply this stuff, okay? Now, the big question that you just raised, and that's every one of these medical decisions has more than one effect. We call it the double effect principle in Catholicism. It's really multiple effects. The truth be known, okay? It's not easy, okay? Well, this comes from Augustine, actually. So the double effect has principles to apply. One is the act or omission can't be evil. So you can't kill the baby to save the mother, you can't kill the mother to save the baby, okay? Or if somebody's drowning and you are able to save that person, you're obliged to do that. If you don't, then it's an omission, that's evil, okay? Intent must be good, pretty obvious. Now, by the way, these are not prioritized, these are the double effect principle. The good can't result from the bad, and the good must be greater than or equal to the bad. So, again, sweet words, but let's get down to the nitty-gritty, okay? This is not, it's still not easy. So what are some of the examples of the double effects, of multiple effects, that have to be taken into consideration when making a decision? This is not an all-inclusive list, but it's what's the success or the probability of success of whatever the procedure is, what's the potential for death, what's the expected lifespan, what's the life quality, the patient's age, secondary illnesses, side effects, caregiver struggle, economic impact. I'll give you an example of the last one, which a lot of people will say, well, that's not really an issue. Well, it is. There was I was in a waiting room for someone, and this family was discussing openly their predicament, and their mother was in a vegetative state. No chance of coming out according to medical opinion. And so so the family, who really I could tell was not attuned or educated in this kind of subject, okay, loved their mother. And they made the decision, knowing that they were going to bankrupt their families, to take her home and keep her alive for infinite period of time, whatever that, or indefinite period of time, okay? Now, the economic impact on those families is part of this. You can't just ignore it, okay? So the question then becomes one of applying those principles on a case-by-case basis and making a decision on what to do. And it's not easy, okay? There are some conclusions that I'm just going to touch on that I kind of hinted at already. The non-dualism, we say suicide's wrong. Prioritized principles, abortion and euthanasia is wrong because it's intentionally killing. Now somebody said to me, well, what about passive euthanasia? This was at the other presentation. And I said, I didn't quite answer it this way, but I've been thinking about it. I said, this is a terrible analogy, but it's like being pregnant. Either you are or you aren't, okay? You can't intentionally kill and then later say, well, I was passively killing. If your intention is to take somebody's life, whether it's shooting them in the head with a gun or removing antibiotics, it's still euthanasia. So in my mother's case, we weren't intentionally killing her. We were letting her die rather than intentionally taking her life, and also honoring her wishes. Okay. Human dignity, drugs okay from animals. I'll give you another example, okay? Personal. My wife passed away 3 years ago. She was 40 years bipolar, a couple years moderate dementia, and then died of ovarian cancer. Okay, she had a blood clot, major blood clot. And the hospital used the drug of choice for the blood clot, which got her past that problem to a certain point. And that drug, and I don't have the name of it here, but it's derived from the intestines of pigs. Okay, you probably know which one I'm talking about. I don't know. At any rate, it's not important. He knows probably. So I go right around this time. I'm going out to the bioethics conference on the West Coast, where I've got Eastern traditions and others, and I'm listening. And I gave him a case study without telling him it was my wife. And I said, can the person use that drug? The answer is, we believe in not killing anything, which sounds noble. But in the case, when you apply belief systems, they have consequences. And so the answer was, no, you can't. The takeaway that I had was that my wife's life was no more valuable than the life of a pig. I did not tell those people it was my wife, because they're good people. They mean well. They're loving people. They mean well. I didn't want to hurt them. But I can tell you, this stuff has consequences. And when I saw the doctors of that tradition struggle at that bioethics conference with their own belief system, it gives me goosebumps, because they were struggling with this, because they wanted to be principled, but their principles were leading them to a path that they felt uncomfortable with. And I can't speak for all of them, okay? Now, here was the issue about judging people, okay? What is this moral culpability? To be morally culpable in the eyes of God, in the Catholic tradition, you have to have three things. You got to have the act or omission has got to be morally wrong, and only an informed conscience can tell you that, and I'll get into what that means. You have to have full knowledge and full freedom, and only God knows that. Only God can climb inside your brain and say, you had full knowledge and full freedom. Okay? So the result is, we can't say anybody has sinned. It's impossible. We are obligated, not only able to, but obligated to make decisions on what is morally right or wrong. But if somebody does the abortion, I can't judge that person. That doesn't mean that I still can't have a moral stand that doesn't agree with it. I think that might have answered one of your questions before, I don't know, whatever. So, what is the operative word here is the informed conscience.
So, Bob, just to kind of recap or summarize, there's a difference between being principled and being judgmental. And you can have the principle and you can have the belief that abortion's wrong, but in the case that somebody gets it, you can still think it's wrong while also not judging them for it.
Correct. And that's a subtlety that I find almost unique in Catholicism as opposed to the other Christian religions. And the reason I say that is I've explored this subject with Baptists, a lot of different Christian faiths. And the term sin is thrown around so loosely that there's no distinction between subjective and objective sin. Even Catholics will use the term sin applying to both, but at least we know the distinction, or should. And that's why I'm careful to say morally wrong act or omission as opposed to sinful.
Makes sense.
So if somebody sees somebody shoot somebody, a lot of Christians would say that person committed a sin. Not Catholic. We as Catholic can't say that person in the eyes of God committed a sin. We can say that that act or omission was sinful, but that's even, I don't like the word sin being thrown around so much like that.
So when did this theory and principle develop in the Catholic faith?
You asked that, somebody else asked that question. It's actually been developed over centuries, starting in the 4th century, I would say, mainly with Augustine, which was that list of things that the double effect, okay? Actually, that's also part of his just war theory. Very similar.
Sorry, I would like to revise my question. When was it incorporated into the Catholic belief rather than just developed? Because I think there's a difference there, right?
Yeah, it was a process of incorporation because science was starting to challenge things. I'll give you an example. In the Dark Ages, there was people were coming to their priest and saying, if this happens, what should I do? Or actually, no. And they were driving the priest crazy. They were trying to give them good answers, okay? And so the Catholic Church wrote, I wish I could remember the name of it, but volumes of scenarios and what the priest was supposed to tell them. Now, back then, people didn't know how to read. So the priest was the guy who knew how to read, and he was supposed to apply this and look in the book. Well, that was legalistic. It failed. So to answer your question, there's been a process of early church dabbling in subjectivism, then going to legalism with his books, and then ending in principled. And so it's been a process. It's not, and it's been clearly attempts to do what they thought Jesus wanted, but screwed up. Okay? And young religions, every religion has a fundamentalist wing. And so there's always a legalistic wing to every religion. And Catholicism's gone through that and abandoned it.
Okay.
But there are still some fundamentalist Catholics around. You know, you can always find somebody, you know. During the Crusades, if somebody didn't convert to Catholicism, they were killed. And the logic was, well, we're just expediting their journey. They're through anyway, which is ridiculous, okay? Now you see that in a younger religion, like Islam, to a certain extent, okay? Because it's a younger religion. So it's this human desire for absolute answers. And the informed conscience is challenging, which is what I'd like to get to in this informed conscience. The informed conscience. The operative word is informed. How do we make these moral decisions on double effect, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da? How do we apply it? Okay. 3 things are required. Biological working brain, informational, we need true input, and spiritual indwelling spirit. And I'm going to explain each of these, okay? And I'm going to do it a little bit more from a science standpoint, and please bear with me if I say things that you already know, or maybe I'm not smart enough or whatever, okay? The first is biological, and you've heard Phineas Gage's story, okay, so I won't dwell on it. But obviously this is a measure of conscience. Where is the conscience in the brain? And the truth is nobody knows, but it's probably in the frontal lobes. That they play a major role, and it's a younger part of the brain. So when Phineas lost his frontal lobes, he was no longer church-going. He started to womanize and curse and drink and da-da-da-da. And it's an interesting, but I won't get into it. You've heard it before. The other is the scientific search for consciousness. And Michael May, I think, is an interesting example of that. Have you heard about Michael May? Michael May lost his eyesight when he was like 3 months old. And in a very unusual operation, when he was in his 40s, medicine decided they thought they could restore his vision, which is very unusual. And so they performed the operation, and when they unwrapped his eyes, they had his 2 children and his wife sitting in front of him, whom he had never seen before. And suddenly he saw them, he saw everything. And they thought, this is it, this is great. He couldn't remember his wife's face from one day to the next. There were problems. There were problems. He couldn't tell the difference between, in depth of field, he couldn't tell the difference between the forest and the trees. He couldn't tell the difference between an object square flying at him and not. A whole bunch of problems, okay? Now with time, this corrected itself, but we know that the brain's ability the brain has 2 sides, the conscious and the unconscious. And the brain couldn't handle this flood of information. So it had to start wiring itself in the unconscious so that when he saw a little mole here, immediately he knew it was his wife. He didn't have to go through all of the details of the eyebrows and everything else. And so things corrected itself. So he missed out from 3 months old to his 43, the opportunity to have his brain start wiring the unconscious. Okay, so scientific unknowns, we don't know where consciousness is. In that case, science still doesn't know. We don't know free will, where it exists. We're not real sure in the brain of the difference between imagination and reality, or brain and mind. I hate the word mind because nobody knows what it is. The closest I've heard of description is the brain is the hardware and the mind is the software, but who knows? I mean, brain is at least more scientifically grabbable. Mind is, So there is such a thing as collective consciousness and conscience. English is an interesting language. It's one of the few languages that has two words, consciousness and conscience. All the Romance languages, French, Italian, only have one word. Greek only had one word, synodesis. So is there such a thing as collective consciousness? Well, yeah, medicine, science, we have a collective understanding of what's real out there. And collective conscience, well, religion has, people of a certain religion believe certain things. The state has certain rules and laws. So this gets back to the second subject, and that's informational. Where are we going to get our information from? To feed to the brain, to enable us to make these decisions. Well, this is just a rough list. Okay, it's not all inclusive. But every one of these things has to be taken into consideration when making a decision and applying your principles. Okay? Now, I'm not going to get through all of these religious teachings, sacred scripture, natural laws, civil laws, medical experts, spiritual advisors, scientific studies, etc. But I'm going to look at the last one more closely because it leads me into the next and the final subject. And that is, there has been a recent study done by Lisa Miller, who's going to be in town in a few weeks, a couple weeks. Yeah. And the editor of this described her research here as the first solid indication that the brain changes if you have a religious belief and practice it regularly, regardless of the religious belief. And it relates to the cortical thickening, which relates to lessened chance of depression. Now, this is not prayer. This is just practice belief system. And so he really praised this research. And these are the MRI scans. And what she did is she took existing databases. So she didn't have to scan new patients. All she did is go back to the databases, ask people to say whether they really were religious or not, if they attended church services regularly, whatever. It was mostly Christian because it was done in this country, but it really wasn't intended to be just Christian. It was across the board, and from what I understand of it, it applied in different faiths. Okay. Another scientific result that science has come to accept is confirmation bias. Have you heard of confirmation bias? Okay, so I don't have to go into this. It's part of human nature. In Catholicism, we might call it original sin, because original sin isn't really a sin. It's this is what it is, okay? Do you know what it is? Okay, so I don't have to repeat. So the question is, how do we take all of this scientific data and all of this information from state laws, our religious beliefs, and avoid this problem?
So we just had epidemiology where we learned about this.
Oh, really?
And the way that they taught us to avoid confirmation bias, not in the case of religion, but in general, is by going in and having a exploration or a discovery phase of the research where you're not asking any questions and you're just kind of filtering for differences that pop out.
Good. Let me give you another way, okay? A spiritual way.
Okay.
There are a couple ways you can do this. That's, I'm sure, at least one. Another is psychotherapy, perhaps, talking to somebody who's got a perspective, whatever. But you're still fighting against the human tendency, even when you're doing what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. And so it comes down to this conscious-unconscious concept, okay? That the unconscious is fast, it's automatic, implicit, it's heuristic, takes everything into account almost at the same time, intuitive, reactive. It's the oldest part of the brain. The youngest is the conscious part. And so the problem is the unconscious. The conscious part is slow, systematic, explicit, analytical. What they're trying to get done is in the conscious.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
The question is, can we unload the unconscious to the conscious? And why is that important? Well, the unconscious contains a lot of stuff. Michael May needed it. It contains breathing. Think about breathing every day. You're going to croak. I mean, habits, both virtues and faults. Prejudices, whether it's religious, sexual, racism, or whatever. All the isms are buried in this unconscious. Worldviews, different belief faiths.
Do you think that's can you explain more about how that's in the unconscious? Because doesn't someone choose to believe in a certain...
Well, I think what happens is that if you're raised in Tibet, you're going to probably be Buddhist. Now, did you choose that? Yes, you chose it, but you were exposed more to one. If you're in Italy and you're Catholic, you're probably not going to be Buddhist because nobody was there talking about Buddhism. Okay, so yes, you chose it with less data available, and then it's stored in the unconscious to save you the time of having to reevaluate it all the time. Michael May, recognizing his wife's face.
This is a question I think about, and related to, I think, Lisa Miller's work is I personally think maybe that it's you're born, you have an unconscious part that is faith, and what becomes more the conscious part is a faith, as in a specific faith, while faith as kind of like a spiritual, like whether you are or are not, is maybe something I think is more unconscious.
So you're saying the unconscious is unchangeable then, because if you're born inherently with the ability to have faith or not have faith, then, but people do go through that change, you know.
Yeah, people go through it, and that becomes where you were mentioning that story where someone changed their Catholic faith was very young, and this is probably, I mean, this is just something that I was thinking about. But I remember when we did, actually I don't know if you were there for that. We walked along the labyrinth at St. Thomas. And how I think the labyrinth is such a great analogy for you can be as close as possible to your faith or as far away as possible, but you never know where, and you constantly vacillate between being closer and being further away from your faith. But that, like, the center of that labyrinth is always there. But yeah, it's kind of one of those hard things you have to like.
Is that permanent, or is it like a one thing?
The labyrinth, it's still there. Yeah, it's still there. At St. Thomas.
You gave me a perfect segue, because that labyrinth is important. Okay. Anyway, how do you unload the unconscious to the conscious? And basically, in prayer, we're freeing up the conscious mind through prayer, so that the unconscious can unload. Okay. Now, one study on this was just done, and it's going to be published, and that is practice forgiveness prayer. And I won't go through these graphs, but this was basically fMRI study. People studied and their anxiety, depression, optimism, spirituality all improved, okay? And it was basically 1 hour per week, 6 weeks discursive praying, discursive prayer. That previous slide, or 2 slides back, there are 2 types of prayer. One is discursive, where you speak, or at least you're using thoughts. The other is letting go of your thoughts. That's contemplative. So the research on discursive here showed some interesting results, and it's going to be published shortly. This prayer practice decreased depression and anxiety scores. This lasts up to at least a year. The precuneus, the self-reference, was changed because we know neuroplasticity. The medial prefrontal cortex, the cognitive control over emotion, was improved, and the Hebanula processing of negative events was changed. So it had an impact, okay? Now, there is this other type of prayer called contemplative prayer, which is letting go of thoughts, which is even in my view, a stronger way of freeing up the conscious so that the unconscious can unload and we can deal with confirmation bias. And so every faith has a contemplative tradition, and the word contemplative is a very general term. Some people will say, well, meditation, mysticism, whatever, all of those have varying definitions depending on the belief system. Meditation particularly has. So the word contemplation is pretty much generally accepted. Christianity is called mysticism, not because it's magic, but because the Catholic Church didn't understand it, so they let the monks and nuns do it and says, this is a mystery to us, go for it. Judaism, Kabbalah, Islam, Sufism, Rumi, fantastic. Buddhism, Hinduism, etc. And letting go of thoughts, one of the ways is to walk the labyrinth. Okay, so here's an MRI study that was done by Andrew Newberg on some Franciscan Catholic nuns that were practicing centering prayer, which is what I teach, which is very similar to some of Zen Buddhism, very similar. And what's interesting about Zen is it allows for a belief in a God, so it's more of a practical way of approaching this. And so because of neuroplasticity, their word changes. There were physical effects from this prayer measured by Benson out of Harvard. He was probably the first. And a lot of the research on this form of prayer is on Buddhist, Tibetan Buddhist monks. They really got way ahead of how to do this. But it's not unique to them. It's very strong in the Catholic tradition, but most people don't know about it, okay? Because it's in the monasteries. I learned it in a monastery when I was there. There are spiritual effects. Everybody's different. Some people gain wisdom, etc., from it. Most people would report on a sense of peace. And then there's this unloading that happens. So I teach it to somebody. I've taught it to thousands. One guy came back about 3 months later. I said, how's it going? Now, in this prayer practice, you choose a word or as a symbol of your desire to be with God. Then as you become aware that you're engaging your thoughts, you ever so gently return to your word. So it's a symbol of your desire to be with God. It's not not in some of the traditions where it's meaningless. It's just to get you off of it. It actually has that symbolism. I said, well, how's it going? And he said, I started to dream at night what really happened to me in Vietnam. And I said, what did you do then? He said, I became fully aware during the day of what really happened to me in Vietnam. And I said, what did you do then? And he said, I ever so gently let it go and return to God. I didn't know that he was suffering from PTSD. And I told that to one of the heads of the Baylor College of Medicine's psychiatric department. He was stunned. He looked at me, he was just stunned. He dropped his jaw. He said, be honest with you, we don't know how to treat PTSD.
Was that a Lomax?
Is that Lomax? Yeah.
I'm hesitant. I don't want to, whatever. Yeah.
Was that me?
Especially when I go on and say, we don't know how to treat it. So I probably have to cut that out. So
we don't know.
But he was being honest. He was being honest.
Yeah.
And so this is a perfect example of how this unloading can take place through prayer. And we can deal with this confirmation bias. So that's basically it.